Hello and welcome to the School Governance Network. My name is Michael Iannini from PD Academia, and I'm a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant specializing in school governance and leadership and organizational development. I'm joined by Paul Smith from the Future Directors Institute. Paul, you want to give a quick introduction?
Yeah, so we help transform next-gen leaders into boardroom influencers, working with the next generation of aspiring directors, emerging directors, founders, and boards.
Yeah, and welcome to our monthly newscast. This is May 2019. This is now, I believe, our 8th newscast, 7th newscast. We've been doing it regularly now for a month. And you know, one of the things that really excites Paul and I about this is we're avidly looking at the news for our own personal reasons, but you know, you're always finding something that reflects in terms of your professional life and the work that you do. And when you take a look at some of the things going on out there in the world, they directly do impact our schools. So this is our news through the lens of the boardroom newscast, where today, and Paul, I don't really know how we've let this one go for so long without wanting to talk about it, but it's partisanship. You know, from the US to the UK, and even when you go into the UK a little bit further, you know, I'm astounded by the fact that you have principalities such as Northern Ireland that hasn't had a government for 2 years. You have a larger looming governing body that's just been absorbed with some, you know, much larger issue. You know, I could draw so many different correlations between school groups and then having each individual campus with its own school board. And so if the larger group itself has lost its vision and ability to engage in productive debate, imagine what it does for the school campuses. Or we take a look at those school campuses, which are kind of a mixture of somewhat democratic and not so much democratically composed boards. So you're self-perpetuating board members with maybe some elected members. You know, we talked in our last webinar with Layla about hybrid boards, but there aren't really a lot of them. They're either elected or they're self-perpetuating. You're either China or you're America in terms of like governing, you know, bodies in terms of how things are structured. And you know what? To the credit to the autocrats, they seem to be maybe potentially thriving just because they can make decisions, whereas on the Democratic side, they're struggling to build consensus and get things done for the longer term. There's so many different ways you can look at this. There's so many different connections to school boards, because if you have a school board that's self-perpetuating, that is, you know, maybe not as democratic as some people would like, they have the ability to see through change over a longer period of time. They have the ability to devise and enact long-term visions. Elected boards that switch so regularly, you know, by the time a strategic plan is meant to take root, you know, you have your next governors in place, but without the processes or without that sort of institutional memory to help see it through. Or the commitment, say, from the new board members, let alone a head of school that has a tenure of up to 3 years. So, you know, loads of connections here. But if I was going to take this news piece and distill it into the school board, you know, it looks like this. A parent makes a complaint about required school reading, calling it pornographic. And you get a few sensitive board members that are like, yeah, that does seem a little inappropriate. Whereas other board members are like, hey, look, we're the board, they're management, they choose what's appropriate for the kids. That's not us to get into the curriculum. That's overstep. Or, hey, another big issue that schools are dealing with too is in an especially independent international school environment, there's a lot more competition in a lot of different areas. Say China, for instance, Hong Kong, where I'm based, Singapore. Really kind of expanding out into other markets where this idea of private education is really taken to. But now, because of that competition, schools that have had very strict admission standards, but now are finding themselves, you know, needing to, you know, update facilities. Maybe they need to go out and fundraise, or they're doing it through tuition. Are saying, well, you know, maybe we need to open the doors a little further and allow in different students, other students, or, you know, in the case of China or Hong Kong, maybe we need to look at diluting our internationalness and allow in more overseas Chinese students, which is a huge thing because now you're getting a different type of parent potentially into the school community. And that changes a lot of the community relationships and dynamics. Parent expectations change, what they want from the curriculum changes. And so this sort of previous parent body that, you know, kind of was used to the way things were are starting to realize that in order for this school to exist and continue to provide that level of service in those programs, that, you know, there's going to start to need to be compromises made. And it's very easy for them to start feeling pushed out. And all of a sudden, bipartisanship comes up. Hey, let me draw this back to the news. The whole thing about immigration and people feeling pushed out of their own communities for work. It's happening in our schools. So, hey, you know what? I think I've teed this one up for you. Where do you want to go with this?
Well, first of all, yeah, I can't believe we haven't touched on this given our interest, where our interest lies, and we sort of flirted around different things. But there's always been partisanship in politics, in business, in the community. There's people with different views coming from different angles. But I think what we're seeing now is the rise, and the article I read was more about the rise of toxic partisanship, whereby you come from a position of dogma as opposed to a position of pragmatism, whereby you can have bipartisan agreements, you can have compromise to move things forward. And I think it's really interesting. There was a post by someone on LinkedIn about this, which went viral about this, and there was a discussion in the comments about where does the blame lie? Because obviously, you know, we're humans, we like to know the reasons, therefore the who's to blame. And obviously, a large part of the consensus was around the media and the role the media is playing. And especially, you know, we've got an election down in Australia currently going on, and the media are increasingly becoming partisan, especially on the traditional right of politics, because especially down here, the right of politics is under threat, or the traditional right is under threat from the left or the independent side or the centre. And so, you know, the media is starting to have a stronger voice, especially as the traditional media themselves are in potential death throes because of social media and the ability for people to communicate directly. So you're getting, and again, in this complex, busy world of loads of messages heading towards the voter, and may I add, it's still great to be able to choose one's leaders and have a say in some way, a vote. You know, as you say, you know, depending on how you live and how stable your system is, you know, often autocrats maybe are better than benevolent dictators. I don't know, who knows these days. But what you're finding is, to cut through the noise, you need to shout louder and be more extreme, even if that's not really your position. So you've got this sort of communication cycle, which is working towards the edges to get cut through, to get clicks, to have your voice heard, to sit within the Twitter sphere, as it were. And all it does is it depresses everybody else who just want to check out of the whole situation, and it becomes like this noise of this extreme side. And then what that means is, though, that you can no longer have a bipartisan let's meet in the middle, because hold on, we've been shouting each other from the edges for so long. Anyway, so that's my rant. But at the end of the day, going back to all the news bits and that sort of side of things, and I'll relate it to schools in a sec if I can, but the blame, you could say, starts with the media, but the media get paid by us and advertisers. But advertisers, at the end of the day, it's the consumer who are to blame, because we are too lazy to actually dig deeper. We are happy to be fed headlines which fit within our worldview or a small bubble, and we are not willing to use a bit more time to actually dig a bit deeper and seek out the truth, or whatever it happens to be, or seek out more angles. And when I say we, I mean a broad brush statement. There's plenty of people who do. But again, increasingly, we're just happy to go, you know what, yeah, that's just reaffirming some part of my worldview, and it's drilling me down to there's no way I can ever listen. That's what you're getting now. Logic is out the water. You know, it's now, it doesn't matter how logical your argument, I will stay here, and that's it. And increasingly, where politics was all about behind the doors, behind the scenes, negotiations, it's so much more played out in public now, you're not getting that. So how does that fit with schools? You know, as you say, especially boards, I think boards have to remember what their role is. Directors governors have to remember what their role is, and to be a bit more positive whilst you've got all this stuff going on. You know, maybe school boards can actually role model for everybody else, because their direct impact is on a child's education, a child's future. And we're all talking about let's think about the children, what about the children and their future? And there's a big thing about climate change. Obviously, it's gaining press again after another 10 years of being in the doldrums. It's now decisions. Everybody's talking about climate emergencies again, which is fantastic. Not in terms of it's fantastic that it's happening, but in terms of the conversation. But, you know, maybe schools can be the role models for the rest of the community, given the fact that so many schools and they have such an impact on families and children. You know, the board can actually say, you know what, instead of going the way everybody else is going, and that partisanship and that dogma and that single issue agenda, they can go the other way and say, you know what, we're actually going to role model something a bit better. And as we discussed prior to recording, I think there's a few things that are critical to that. One is a strong chair, not a dictatorial chair, but a strong chair which encourages inclusivity in voices, keeps people on track, doesn't allow for needless distractions, and contextualizes what's going on to create some sort of consensus. I think also onboarding new directors carefully, recruiting new directors and governors and onboarding them carefully to orientate them to their role and the responsibility to a wider community, not just a single stakeholder group. And we're going to be touching on onboarding governors in a webinar in June, so keep a lookout for that. And then there's obviously other protocols, which I know Michael and I can talk about, around how to actually go through a process of hearing all those voices and making sure that you actually create some sort of blend of majority and minority views whereby everybody feels like they've been heard. And I think that's from a human aspect. Often it doesn't matter if it's our way or not. We just like to be known that we like to know that we've been listened to and had some sort of input into a decision. I think that's critical part of this whole thing. And again, I think I've done a lot now. I don't know where I'm going with it, but it's such a passion thing. Like, you know, again, going back to proper debate, where it's actually a debate. And, you know, I talk about a lot about emotional intelligence and what it means, because obviously there's lots of different definitions, but there's 3 elements to me. And the last element is a key part of what we're talking about here. One is that self-awareness, you know, just understanding who you are. 2 is that being able to see from somebody else's point of view, that empathy, the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, which is, again, absolutely critical. To the 3rd bit, which I think doesn't get talked about so much when it comes to emotional intelligence, is the ability to have your mind changed. And again, in the boardroom, if you're coming in with a fixed view and a belief, nothing wrong with those things. But if you're not open to have your mind changed, then you're not doing your job as a school governor or board director.
Yeah. No, I like that you mentioned about that broad stroke about people needing to take more responsibility. And if I were to connect that to schools, I would say by people or parents, because there's just a lot of parents that just don't get involved in terms of the governance of a school, which for many boards could be a good thing because they don't want activist parents. But at the end of the day, if people are involved and understand the purpose of the school and what that school does, they generally do tend to be much more supportive. However, when a school is not transparent and decisions are made that don't rhyme with some of the community members, that's when they're going to raise their voice. So full transparency actually is probably the best way to go, so as to avoid future calamity. At the same time too, when there's full transparency, people have a much better understanding of what the board does, the direction that the board is going, and so that when the board needs help, people are in a much better position to offer it because they know what they're going to be getting into. And that comes back to the recruitment part. So recruitment is incredibly important. If boards are not communicating with their communities regularly in terms of what they do and what they need, when they need it, they're not going to get it. And when they make a decision that people don't like, they're going to get a lot more than they want. Then when they move from that recruitment into the onboarding, that's when they have to really start to, I hate to say it, but indoctrinate and say, hey, we are one voice. You're coming into here maybe with your own ideas, and that's great because that's going to help us think creatively. But when you walk out of here, regardless if you got what you want, you're going to have to say, yeah, that's what we agreed on. And you're going to have to own it and believe in it because that's what's best for the students. And at the end of the day, when I work with schools, I like to focus with new boards and especially a new head of school. I like to do a values-based activity first. I like to really walk them through and help them make explicit their own values. Then we spend some time, not too much time, you'd be surprised how quickly this goes, 15 minutes. We're able to actually identify values that are in common and values that can drive us in terms of our leadership. Then we can move into defining how we want to lead as a board and the attributes that they have to demonstrate inside the boardroom and outside the boardroom. And that becomes like their social contract. And then it's up to a strong chair to basically hold people accountable for it. But now that said, a strong chair is supported by various tools. Some of the tools that I think you and I favor quite a lot are protocols, meeting protocols, which are very simple. It's basically a introduction to the topic, and then people have a role. So then we're going to be delegating to everybody for this part of the conversation, we're only asking clarifying questions. During this part of the question, we're only asking probing questions. Now we're going to have everybody gets 1 minute to voice what they've heard, or, protocols are structured in many different ways, but you see what I'm getting at, right? This is very instructional, very systematic, and it's meant to lead you down towards building consensus on that topic issue. Like you have a great protocol about debates. Do you want to give a quick introduction to that?
Yeah, I just want to support what you're saying as well. Again, it sounds really sort of like it doesn't. Someone listening to that saying, what, we've got to do the staged approach of who talks when. Well, the alternative to that, and again, I think, is people talking over each other or dominant voices and other people. So what's better, having structure where everybody's allowed to talk but within a time period, or having free-flowing debate where strong voices speak up and dominate, people speak over each other, and other people who want time to reflect, to listen, don't get a chance to do that. So again, people listening to this will understand what they're like. I just came back yesterday from a workshop with a board and a governing group, so management as well. And, I was a couple of times during that, they were talking over each other, and I was like, that's when I sort of explained the same protocol that I'm going to explain. So it's a protocol basically from a debate whereby you pose a particular question, which is a statement potentially. So it could be, let's say, something which is contentious or potentially contentious, where you need this system to allow all views to come out on both sides of an argument. And it could be, the statement could be, going back to one of your examples, we should up our intake of local students to X% of our student body. And that might be particularly contentious, right? So the process is, first, everybody in the room gets a allotted time, 2 or 3 minutes. And we did this in a workshop. It was wonderful. I remember that workshop we had around recruitment and onboarding directors, and it was we used this, and everybody came out, wow, that was actually a great process. Everybody gets a chance to express their view on that statement, either for or against, but only a singular view in terms of all their arguments for, or if they're against, all their arguments against. And then everybody in the room, so like everybody in the room who's involved, then in the next round, everybody has to take an opposite position to their original position. So everybody gets to play devil's advocate. And that's that part of the EQ. You have to put yourself in the shoes of someone who'll be arguing, and even then just try and articulate an opposing view to your own. Can you imagine that? Like in immigration debates, in any sort of debate, whereby the person who's saying, no more immigrants, actually literally has to say the arguments why we would want immigrants. And they would know some arguments because they would have heard them, but they actually have to say themselves. That actually does some strange stuff to the brain. And that's the power of this debating technology. I suppose it is a technology. It's just not a digital one. So after the second round, when everybody's had a chance to say the opposite side, the third round is everybody then gets to say what's the one thing they've heard which has been the most compelling or potent. And it could be something they said or something anybody else said. And then what happens then is you then vote on the statement and you get a view, and then you basically then what happens then is you allow the minority view to discuss what's going on, and you go through various symptoms of the same thing. And what you then do is try and operationalize the output at the end. What happens now, I've cut short a little bit because I think the bit up front is the most powerful part, because it gets everything out and it gets everybody playing both sides. Now, you may not get consensus view. You may not get even an easy discussion. But what it does do is allow everybody to have a voice. It allows everybody to own the decision because they had their say, and everybody got to play lots of different roles. There's no talking over each other. Everybody's listening, not to respond, but to wait to have their say and really hear what everybody else is saying. It actually creates a more collegiate environment and takes away any toxicity of a particularly touchy subject. And actually creates artificially, but then by that naturally, respect, because everybody's having to really think deeply. So it's a great process. It takes practice, but once you get into it, you'll never want to go back. And look, it can be time pressured, but that's why you have to set your agenda and the product protocol. Sorry, I've taken up quite a bit of time, but it is such a great process.
Yeah, and you talked about like the toxicity of it. One of the reasons behind that is because people actually genuinely feel heard in protocols, and it comes back to especially in very partisan environments. There are people that just feel that they haven't been heard in the past, and the only way they're going to be heard is by raising their voice or by taking a stance that is going to be immovable. And it's like, you know what? I've given. I'm giving no more. Protocols basically ensure that everybody gets an opportunity to give, and that everybody, more importantly, has to listen. Your protocol in particular forces them by wearing the other shoes, if you will, forces them to paraphrase what they've heard, so that they can demonstrate to the other person, all right, I've heard you. And then that next step of trying to identify the most compelling arguments actually then basically filters out all the nonsense, puts in front of people those most important elements of the debate that they can actually have a logical discussion around. And that's the most important thing. And, for people listening to this saying, yeah, well, what happens if, basically people just throw their hands up because the other side is being ridiculous when they're asked to play the devil's advocate? Well, you know what? That's indicative of another issue. That's indicative of the fact that you've never actually gone through the forming stages with your team, with your board, to actually build trust, to identify values. You've probably in the past have disrespected each other, and you need to make up for that. Before you can move into productive debate, you need to make up for the past wrongdoings. And if you're in a stalemate situation, or there's any sort of animosity, take a break, put everything else aside and say, look, in order for us to govern effectively, we need to govern together. If we all believe that, let's put everything else aside and let's just focus on how we're going to do that together. And then just by doing that alone, we'll make the rest of the agenda go much quicker. And so, partisanship, news, distilled all the way through from from the issues of Brexit right down to allowing in a greater body of students that the current community doesn't want, immigration, whatever you want to call it. I think we've done really good justice to this, Paul.
Yeah.
And considering how this is also, I like to use the word teeing it up. It's getting us ready for a webinar June 18th on onboarding. I can't imagine anything more immediate for schools in June than that topic, because right now many schools are having their AGMs. Right now many schools are taking on board new governors. And when they come on board, they're going to have to figure out what to do with them. They're going to have to figure out, hey, how do we get this going? Hey, you know what? My first advice to you, do a little team building. Let's not just talk them through like what the job is, but do some team building, everybody together. There's, that sort of capital you cannot do without. And that's kind of my final say on partisanship and boardrooms. Paul, any final thoughts?
No, again, we could go for hours on these. These ones are supposed to be 20 minutes, and we've probably gone over a little bit. But I would just like people to listening or watching this to think about. You imagine if political debate or your debate within your family was actually run with that sort of what we call deep democracy style protocol, at least just a little bit, where everybody had to argue both sides of something and actually hear themselves getting outside of their bubble. Just imagine if we had that process where everybody was heard and not talked over and not belittled and respected. There'll be a very different world we'd live in. We may not get universal agreement because people do have ideological beliefs, but at least we'd get respect for everybody else's opinion. And that's all we can really ask for most of the time. So I think going back to what I initially said, schools can be role models here to each other, to children coming up. You can show that you are a respectful, considered, informed group of people. We want our kids to grow up to be the same. So start there, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, put the students at the center. Well, Paul, thank you again for an awesome newscast. Looking forward to get online with you for the webinar June 18th on onboarding. For the rest of you, hey, please follow us on LinkedIn through the School Governance Network. You can also go and find through the School Governance LinkedIn network, through that chat, we have an archive of all of our past videos with links to where the other videos are. We have quite an archive now on a variety of topics. Yeah, so it's fun. It's been a good year. Hey, fist bump. There you go. Cheers, Paul. Have a good one.
Thanks, Michael.